All right, the Civil War went from 1861 through to 1865. And we're going to discuss it a little bit today. All right, 1861. Secession, that first started 1860 in December with South Carolina, and then moved through all the southern states, or seven southern states, before Lincoln took office in 1861. The inauguration was on March 4th, 1861. As soon as he was elected, they were starting to write up articles of secession in order to leave. These states here seceded after the Battle of Fort Sumter. These states here and the Indian Territories, although the Indian Territories were kind of split themselves, some of the Indian nations within Oklahoma sided with the South, with the Confederacy. Some of them sided with the North. These states were all slave-owning states. Kentucky originally voted to secede. However, they tried to remain neutral, but both armies were using Kentucky to run troops and guns through, and so they ended up joining back up with the Union. Missouri, their government left. Their government went down south and then voted to secede. But the interim government, they became like a supposed government exile. But the government that stayed in Missouri decided to stay with the Union. So it was a little complicated with Missouri and Kentucky. But for the most part, these border states that had slaves stayed in the Union after Fort Sumter, as well as New Jersey also had slavery, and then the territories of Nebraska and Utah also had slavery, and they stayed with the North as well. All right, Battle of Fort Sumter. This is actually Fort Sumter here. Over here, you can see the land. What happened with this battle? Confederates had seized all the lands except for this and another fort named Pitkin. Lincoln informed South Carolina that they were going to resupply. South Carolina said nope. Commander refused to surrender. So here on these shores, Confederates set up gun battery, fired on Fort Sumter. They considered Lincoln's proposed to resupply as an act of war, so they preemptively fired on Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter surrendered, and immediately after, in what was perceived as a Northern act of unprovoked aggression, 3.5 more states seceded. If we go back and look here, Virginia seceded. West Virginia, the counties in Western Virginia, they decided to stay in the Union. They were admitted into the Union as a slave state. And then later on in the war, Tennessee is repatriated as a slave state as well. All right, call to arms. This is Virginia forces. This is up in Manhattan. These are propaganda bills or recruitment posters sent out by both the North and the South. Lincoln, he blockaded the entire East Coast. He sent the Navy all the way up and down so that the Confederacy couldn't resupply from other nations. At the beginning of the war, the South had strong economic ties with Great Britain, selling cotton. By the end of it, Great Britain had completely cut off the cotton trade, thus hitting the Confederacy pretty hard economically. Lincoln, he stood up a federal army, much like the Continental Army under Washington. Lincoln stood up a federal army. The Confederacy, however, as you remember, Confederacy means loosely organized. They based their army on state command. The most important one being the Army of Northern Virginia, commanded by Robert E. Lee. 286 officers left the Union and joined the Confederacy. If you remember from the reading, Harper's Ferry, that was a Northern abolitionist. He was also a secessionist. Um, Brown invaded or took over the armory at Harper's Ferry, and Robert E. Lee, commanding U.S. Union Marines, took back the armory. These officers, they had all served together under McClellan. Robert, the big names that you remember from your biographies: Robert E. Lee, Grant, Sherman, Jeb Stuart, all of those guys under McClellan, they served during the Mexican-American War. Different units, they commanded different units as colonels, but they were serving under the same command. So they were all American soldiers, but 286 U.S. officers left and went to the South. So they had a pretty good officer corps. It's kind of make up North and South. North had managed manufacturing, food, crops, manpower, sea power, railroads. This is the railroads here, right? Railroads in the North, railroads in the South. If you remember from discussion on the North, the Middle, and the Southern colonies, the middle states at this time, they're the breadbasket of the nation. This is where all the food crops are grown in these middle colonies, and they stayed in the Union. The South, they had geography and they had time. As the defenders, they didn't have to do anything. They had already left the Union. All they had to do was just stay put, just defend the Union. The stated purpose of the war was to keep the Union intact. And so in order to do that, the South didn't have to invade. Now, geography. I am firmly convinced that the reason the South was winning the war for the first 3 years of the Civil War was because the North couldn't figure out the road systems. The roads are few and far between. They wound around mountains and through hollows and valleys and around rivers and everything else. And if you look in depth at the battles that are fought, a lot of it is the North just being lost, not knowing where they are, where they're going, or how to get there. All right, 1862, the war spread out over three fairly different regions. In the East, you have the Army of the Potomac, is stationed in Washington, D.C., Delaware, Maryland area. Reason being is because Virginia is right next door and can easily attack Washington, D.C., attack the capital. In fact, that happens later on towards the end of the war. McClellan, he picks up this huge army, and he has to split it in half in order to keep a rear guard in Washington, D.C. So he can't really attack with a whole lot. Federal plans are to take out Richmond right away rather than march in and take out the army. They just want to go straight down and capture the capital. Richmond, Virginia is the capital of the Confederacy at this time. 1862, we also see the Emancipation Proclamation. This had several iterations. Lincoln rejected most of them because the stated purpose of the war was to preserve the Union, not to end slavery. This became a political issue, however, as well as a military issue, but it became a political issue with Great Britain trying to enter the war on the side of the South in order to get a hold of the cotton industry. That Britain's manufacturing industry relied heavily on Southern cotton. So, but at the time, Britain was so anti-slavery that they were actually using their large fleet to go around the world to end slavery everywhere else in the world. So the issue of slavery became a political issue, and Lincoln issued this Emancipation Proclamation, and it only targeted the Confederate states, the states in rebellion at the time. So it didn't touch Maryland, Delaware, West Virginia, down here in Louisiana, New Orleans had been recaptured, Missouri, Kentucky, obviously Nebraska and Utah. And at this time, Tennessee had been repatriated as well. And so Tennessee was exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation. It only affected the southern states that were in active rebellion at the time. All right, Twin Rivers Campaign in the West. Now, this isn't west of the Mississippi. This is just west of the Appalachian Mountains. The West in this instance means the Midwest. So you're talking Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio River Valley, Tennessee River Valley, that area there. They didn't have roads. Mostly if they were marching overland, they were cutting their own roads. They had very few railroads. A lot of the battles that the North fought were to just take control of whatever few railroads the South had. And they used the rivers a lot. So both sides were building navies on the rivers. Navy didn't really exist on the rivers at this time because these were internal waterways to the United States. So both the North and the South. And these are ironclad, big guns, metal plating, metal armor plating. And the Confederates, they built forts along Tennessee and the Cumberland rivers in order to keep the North out. These became fairly big amphibious battles during the Civil War. And west of the Mississippi, not a whole lot went on west of the Mississippi. There was one big raid where General Sibley from Texas, he went up through New Mexico and into Colorado, way up here towards Denver. He did this by bypassing. He actually didn't fight the federal forts along the way. He just went around them. But by the time he got all the way up there, his supply lines were just stretched out. They couldn't supply. This is roughly 800,000 miles. The supply lines couldn't supply the troops, so he ended up having to retreat. Sort of a success, but he ended up retreating because he couldn't feed his troops. All right, 1863, Gettysburg. I will leave this link so that you guys can watch that. That was a big battle of 1863. A lot of it was just jockeying for position, back and forth, back and forth. This is what really turned the tide of the war towards the Union. 1864 and into 1865. This is the end, towards the end of the war. It's General Grant. Remember, he served alongside Lee in the Mexican-American War. He was about the fifth or sixth general that Lincoln had gone through trying to lead the army. Finally decided on him. He also reported directly to Secretary of War and to Lincoln himself. However, he stayed in the field. He was a battlefield commander. He made all his plans and preparations while in the field. He didn't just sit back in Washington and try to plan attacks from there. He was in there with the troops, fighting from the front, as they say. So Lee gets cornered at Richmond, and McClellan, Burnside, Hooker, they all retire after meeting Lee in battle. What that means is every general who came face to face with General Lee in battle ended up quitting afterwards, quitting or getting fired. However, Grant, he continued. He met and lost and just kept pressing Lee. Finally, this town called Petersburg, down in here somewhere. Lee gets caught up and he has to dig in Petersburg. With that, they end up fighting. Is really the first modern trench warfare. Trench warfare is something you usually associate with World War I. And they had used trenches. George Washington used trenches in the Chesapeake invasion during the Revolutionary War. However, this was two sides dug in trenches, fighting back and forth. Lee sends early north through Shenandoah. Shenandoah is a valley, became kind of pivotal for both the North and the South. And he got all the way up and raided Washington, D.C. It's one of the only times, there's only been two presidents who fought or led troops on the field of battle as sitting presidents. And it's the only time that a sitting president has come under fire while in battle. Lincoln was actually shot out quite a bit by Confederate troops. One of the guys who was standing next to him ended up getting wounded in the leg during the battle. But ultimately, Jubal Early, he couldn't take Washington. He couldn't even march into Washington Reason being is because he had marched his troops something like 300 miles in 2 days, 3 days, and they were just too tired. They couldn't mount a proper offensive, so they had to hang back and rest up first before they could attack. And by that time, Grant had reinforced the troops in Washington, D.C. Sherman's great wheel. Sherman came down from the north and then just cruised around this way, big wheel, kind of like a wagon wheel. And he marched on Savannah and burning Georgia, burning Atlanta, that whole deal. 90% of his troops were combat veterans. 90% of his troops had already seen combat. Along the way, he destroyed everything. It was kind of a scorched earth campaign. He lived off the land, meaning he took the crops, and then what him and his men couldn't eat immediately or carry with them, he burned afterwards. Burned critical buildings, burned infrastructure, destroyed railroads behind him. It's much like Cortez, when Cortez landed in Mexico and his troops started whining that they wanted to go back to Spain. And he said, nope, we're burning the ships. And he burned the ships, and they had no choice except to march on Mexico City. Sherman did something similar. They had no choice except keep marching towards the coast and try to link up with the Union Navy. Lee's last 100 days, this is the very end of the war, April 2nd through the 9th, the Appomattox Campaign, 1865, very end of the war. You see Lee and Sheridan, they're again moving in parallel lines. Lee had to bail out of Petersburg, reason being he was running out of food. He was choked off. Grant was choking him off. Grant was chasing him this way, and Sheridan was moving parallel to him. Because Lee's getting harried the entire way, he can't mount a proper counterattack. He ends up surrendering at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th, 1865. And then that's the end of the war. 4 or 5 very bitter, very bloody years, reduced to a few PowerPoint slides. All right, so what did the war entail? You see this picture here. Balloons were used extensively in the North and the South. They would have guys right up here in the balloon. They were tethered, but one of the wires going up was a telegraph wire, so they would be able to look out 100 miles while up in that balloon and then telegraph what they saw down in the troops. This is actually a raft on one of the river campaigns. So the Civil War, say the first modern war, Civil War was the first use of an aircraft carrier way back when, kind of a steampunk aircraft carrier, but aircraft carrier nonetheless. Total war, they targeted everything: economics, civilian populations, railroads. Or the first industrial war, they used railroads to get around. They used a telegraph to talk. They had balloons. They had steamships, meaning powered under a machine rather than just using the wind or using rowers. They had armor plating. So if you have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments.